Ukraine has hammered an oil pipeline and a gas transshipment plant in a bid to hurt the Kremlin coffers after Vladimir Putin rejected a peace plan and said he's ready to go to war with Europe. Chechnya appears to be in the crosshairs, and there are growing splits between Europe and America, indeed, and within Europe, over plans to seize 100+ billion euros of frozen Russian assets. The one thing we know that Moscow is really scared of. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. The strikes on oil and gas infrastructure. We've seen two things. Overnight, a strike in the port of Temryuk in the Sea of Azov against what appears to be a transshipment facility. That is a mechanism by which liquid natural gas comes from pipelines and can be loaded onto vessels. It's a mechanism for Russia to export gas, a key source of revenue, something that's been closely linked to its sanctions evading shadow fleet, which has been in the spotlight and something Europe has been cracking down on. And then to the north of Ukraine, north of Kharkiv Oblast, we've seen a strike on the Druzhba oil pipeline. That is, at least, according to the Moscow Times, the fifth strike on that pipeline this year. Why is it important? Well, that still supplies oil to Slovakia and Hungary, which have got exemptions from the Europe-wide sanctions because they rely so heavily on that Russian fuel. The countries and their economies would struggle to operate without it. They haven't, as so many other countries have tried urgently to do, they haven't been able to wean themselves off Russian hydrocarbons. Whilst we're on these strikes, also worth mentioning that the Syrzan oil refinery in Russia has also been hit, we understand, overnight, as has a tower block in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. Now, this building appears to be, we understand from local Ukrainian reports, home to the Chechen Security Council. It sits on an avenue named after Kadyrov, the ruler of Chechnya, and indeed the commander of its Akhmat battalion, one of the most formidable units that was thrown into the battle at the very beginning of the war. And I say formidable, particularly notorious for the atrocities that its soldiers committed, both in terms of murdering civilians and torturing prisoners. These strikes, some 650 miles from the closest Ukrainian territory, these do not come in isolation. There have been at least two similar strikes on Chechen soil within the last week. One in Gudermes, that appeared to be on the headquarters of an Akhmat Special Forces battalion, and one in Akhoy Mardan, which appeared to be the offices of the Russian FSB intelligence service. Now, as far as I know, Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for these. Certainly, they have the hallmarks of the sorts of capabilities that Ukraine has displayed itself capable of using. Chechen politics, though, are incredibly violent and volatile. And it is worth noting that Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, has been frail. He's been out of public view for a long time, and we might be seeing some sort of power struggle. At the moment, this has the hallmarks of Ukraine. In the same vein, Ukraine's long-range strikes, its GUR military intelligence unit, has claimed significant successes on the occupied Crimean Peninsula, where it says it's hit an Su-24 fighter jet, radar stations, drones, and indeed a freight train supplying Russia's armed forces. And in Kupiansk, in sort of northern occupied Ukrainian territory, really rather Kupiansk on the front lines, a town that's being fiercely fought over as we speak. Staggering footage this week of what appears to be a drone dropping a thermobaric munition into an apartment building, and that building then collapsing. It's worth pointing out that that building probably would have been in Ukrainian hands just a few days or weeks ago, but the sources we were looking at suggesting it had been occupied by Russia and that a Russian drone unit was inside. How has Russia replied? Well, as always, with missiles and drones. This week, at least 1,300 being fired at targets right across Ukraine. That's about average. What was unusual was that one of those nights we saw some 600. We've also seen jet-powered Shahed drones, or Geran drones, the Russian variation of those Iranian-designed long-range attack drones. So the The jet-powered engine is an evolution. That's not brand new, but on those jet-powered drones, we've seen them armed with air-to-air missiles. That is a relatively new evolution, and that's because of the ways that Ukraine has been shooting these drones down, often using small planes, helicopters, sometimes fighter jets. We've seen helicopters using with machine guns out of the side doors, old-fashioned kind of Cessna single-prop planes, also with simple weapons on the side to shoot them down. The drones armed with air-to-air missiles will allow the fleet to try and defend itself from that sort of attack. So what has Ukraine done? We saw Ukraine using an interceptor weapon, an interceptor drone, to shoot down a jet-powered Shahed. The interceptors, Ukraine appears to hope at the moment, are going to be to give it the edge in defeating the volume of these Shaheds that Russia can fire every night. Crucially, the interceptors are relatively cheap. They sort of take off like quadcopters, often vertically launched, but then can fly horizontally relatively quickly, can home in on their target. And the one we saw in use this week was an R60 with an infrared homing device fitted to its nose, so it could find its way to that target, heat-seeking effectively. Also in the close battle, Pokrovsk continues to be, as I said before, sort of all but fallen. It's hard to know exactly what Ukraine is clinging onto, and because of that also that pocket of land sort of northeast of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, looking incredibly tenuous as well, difficult for Ukraine to cling onto. We've heard from General Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, suggesting that Ukraine is continuing to defend this area, but pretty vague what he was saying, and also sort of acknowledgement in his words of how difficult it was. And then to the southwest of Pokrovsk in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Russia continuing to fight ferociously around Huliapole and making advances there. There is also the battle going on in the diplomatic fronts, the battles in European and American and indeed the Russian capital. Vladimir Putin rejected Ukraine's revised peace plans. Just take you back. Russia drafted a 28-point plan, presented it to America. America delivered it to Kyiv almost as a fait accompli, as if it was a deal that they had endorsed. Kyiv and its European allies and America worked frantically on that document to try and make it something they could accept. It became a 19-point document that was delivered to Russia. Putin said it was totally unacceptable, and he blamed Europe for getting involved and for changing it. Clearly, Europe has a lot at stake and is very interested in seeing this war ended in a way that avoids future conflicts erupting immediately afterwards. And in those remarks, we saw Putin also saying that he is ready to fight Europe if they wish. I mean, that is saber-rattling language, but of course Europe and NATO are concerned that if this war ends in such a way that seems to reward Russia for its wanton and horrific aggression that we've seen against Ukraine, then it may well be encouraged to try it again, either in Ukraine to take more land if it doesn't get as much land as it hopes for, but also particularly the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, feeling particularly exposed. Let's also talk about the money. Follow the money. So much of this conflict appears to hinge on the outcome, on decisions about money. I've touched already in this episode on the impact of the Druzhba pipeline, on the impact of Russia's hydrocarbon and natural gas exports. Two reports today, one on the front page of The Times saying that the UK is trying to unlock efforts to give Ukraine £8 billion worth of frozen Russian assets that are in the UK. This is part of a much wider effort to free up about £100 billion worth of frozen assets. But Bloomberg also reporting today that America has urged European countries not to do this. I mean, this is the schism between the United States and Ukraine's strongest allies in Europe. But I mentioned before there are divisions within Europe as well. Those that want Ukraine to win this conflict and believe that Ukraine can secure a favourable peace, want to give Ukraine that money so that it can bankroll its fight for at least the next 18 months or 2 years. Belgium, which holds most of the frozen Russian assets in Europe, is deeply concerned, if not expressly opposed to these plans. So there's around 210 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets in Europe. About 185 billion of those are in the Euroclear accounts. Now, this is effectively like a complicated bank. It's a central securities depository. Belgium's foreign minister has said that they've been urging Europe to come up with a way not to seize that money, but to find a way of raising loans, perhaps secured on that money, but raising loans from the market to finance Ukraine. But the language we've heard this week from Belgium's Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, has been really extraordinary. He said that people who believe Russia could lose this war, he said it's a fairy tale, it's an illusion. And they're concerned that if they release that money to finance the defense of Ukraine, that Russia will sue them and Russia will win. So they're looking for what they've called ironclad guarantees that Europe would share the risk. And Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz is on his way, I think, to Belgium, but certainly to meet de Wever, I think, today to try and iron out some of those difficulties. This is really important because we know it's something that Russia is deeply concerned about. And we've heard, for example, from Dmitry Medvedev, that sort of frothing, blowhard, pro-Putin warmonger, member of the National Security Council, former Russian president, the puppet president who stood in when Putin had a gap as required by the constitution, him suggesting that this would be an act of war, a casus belli, and that money would ultimately be repaid, he claimed, in reparations, war reparations from Europe. Really punchy language, but shows the panic. America, what's America doing? Well, there was a really concerning story in the Wall Street Journal last weekend about the way that Americans close to Donald Trump, donors to his campaign, have been holding meetings with very senior or influential or powerful Russian tycoons and business people to try and secure multi-billion-dollar deals in the event of peace. And this gives us an insight into perhaps the motivations of the Trump White House. For example, Stephen Lynch, a donor to Trump's campaign, according to the Journal, in talks to buy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Gentry Beach in talks to try and buy an Arctic pipeline, or at least invest, buy a stake in those pipelines. That appears to be America's motive, or the White House's motivation, I should say. Today, the White House has published a new national security strategy, and I suspect we'll hear a lot more of this as it soaks in and we get a chance to really digest it. It doesn't really say anything about Russia other than the fact that America wants stability with Russia. About Europe, staggeringly, it talks about cultivating resistance to the direction of travel within Europe. So I would say a deeply concerning document about America's direction of travel and the way they view, or at least the way the administration views Europe and Russia. I know a lot of you watch this in America, and I know a lot of you have different views, and thank you for sharing them in the comments. Before we get to questions, I'm just going to talk about Sabotage. There's been a really interesting summary published by the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Organization, ACLED, which collates information about the conflict. It has recorded some 1,200 incidents of sabotage committed by both sides. Around 60% of those took place inside Russia, around 70% of them against property. Interesting, really, on the scale of these kind of SOE style, that's a Special Operations Executive, the precursors of MI6 and the SAS, those sorts of operations that happen in World War II, happening inside Russia by Ukrainians, and indeed inside Ukraine, sometimes by Ukrainians, sometimes by Russians, but by those opposed to the Kiev regime. And on that note, we heard a very disturbing story this week about a British national, Ross David Cutmore, originally from Dunfermline in Fife, who has been arrested by Ukraine's SBU for spying for Russia, and not just spying, but helping FSB assassins. The FSB is the modern-day successor of the KGB. Cutmore, who's 40 years old, and arrived in Ukraine as a military instructor, although as far as we can tell, as far as our research here in the UK has revealed, his only military experience was less than a year as an officer cadet at university. So someone described him to me as no more combat effective than a lifeboat. But nonetheless, he arrived, tried to provide services as a military instructor, gave that up, offered his services to the FSB, was recruited and was instructed on how to make IEDs, and also given the coordinates of a cache, a weapons drop. He collected a pistol, and we understand that pistol was used in the assassination of one, if not two, activists, one in Odessa and a former MP in the western city of Lviv. If you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. Question number 1. Ukraine has lost. Should it surrender? When does one admit defeat? Ukraine has not lost. It is still in the fight. It is losing territory, and if the conflict continues at the current rate, yes, Ukraine would be defeated. But I've said this before, wars are not linear. I don't want to repeat that argument. When should a country admit defeat? Well, Ukraine is fighting for its survival. So if it stops fighting, it ceases to exist. If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. The decision for Ukraine is what pain are they prepared to accept to continue to exist? Because were they to be conquered by Russia, you have to imagine the sort of consequences that would mean for the entire nation, or the vast majority of the nation living under Kyiv-controlled territory who've supported this war. How would they be treated by a Russian police state? So I think that calculation, the fear of ending up in a gulag or being assassinated or disappeared, will feed into the Ukrainian calculation about how long they continue fighting. They have a lot to fight for, however awful, and it is awful, the conditions are, and a huge price they're paying for this. Question number 2. Russia said at the start of the war they're not fighting for land, so why is land now so important? Well, Russia's come up with all sorts of bogus reasons for this conflict. Fundamentally, it's about Vladimir Putin trying to cement his legacy in the pantheon of the Tsars, what he sees as Peter the Great and Stalin. He's already boasted that he's achieved more than them. He's trying to reclaim what he considers to be Russia's historic lands. This is all about land and influence, power and control. He wants to push Russia's borders back towards Europe to stop Europe and NATO's influence spreading eastwards towards Russia. And the final question for today: why are there no attacks on Moscow or the Kremlin? I'll answer it 2 ways. There have been attacks on the Kremlin. Very early on, we saw, I think, the first drones hitting the Kremlin caused huge shock and amazement that Ukraine had managed to do that. We haven't seen so much of that since. We have seen attacks on Moscow. We have seen the airports regularly getting closed, Moscow's main airports getting closed because of drone strikes in the sky. And we've seen attacks further east and well beyond the range of Moscow. I would suggest the reason the city itself might not be getting attacked as much at the moment is potentially twofold. One, an investment, possibly an investment in the allocation of air defences. Russia may have invested more air defences around the capital to try and shield the institutions, but also the population from the knowledge of the war. And reason number 2, that Ukraine is prioritising other targets. It's prioritising the resources it has to try and degrade Russia's ability to prosecute the war. So it's hitting the oil infrastructure. That has been its primary goal for months now, if not years, and energy infrastructure, trying to hit the Kremlin's coffers, which is where we started, to degrade Russia's ability to continue to fight the war. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I shall do my best to answer as many as I can next time.